Hi, how's it going? My name's Leo Kearse. I'm a comedian. I'm here at Unlocked and I'm interviewing Michelle Ballantyne, the leader of Reform UK Scotland, who yesterday voted against the SNP's hate crime bill. Unfortunately, it still went through. It's quite a pernicious bill. We're going to find out all about it. Hi, Michelle. How are you doing?
Good morning, Leanne. Very well, thank you. And you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to just sort of explain what the bill is and why it's an issue?
I mean, the key problem to part two and the stirring up hatred is it extends into the privacy of your own home. So it doesn't allow you, in reality, I mean, although the Cabinet Secretary would say that this is not the case, but the reality of the way the law is produced and written is that if you have a conversation around your dinner table, and your child or somebody who's at your dinner table then goes out and said, oh, this person said that, you could in effect be arrested for things that you've said around your dinner table. And I don't think it's good enough for anybody to say, but when it goes to court, we'll look at the reasonable person, and the reasonable person would not think that your conversation around your dinner table was stirring up hatred. Well, not many people want to find themselves arrested and having to go to the trouble of trying to defend themselves against something that, frankly, is probably happening around most people's dinner tables. I mean, as a comedian, you're going to be under threat. Your jokes, the things that make us laugh are quite often very close to the bone.
Yeah, no,
And that could
absolutely.
now be considered stirring up hatred.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm getting old. Well, I am old, really. And I grew up in an era of jokes and television programs that, frankly, would all fall foul of this bill now.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it's that whole thing about where do you, oh, blimey, I really haven't cracked this, have I?
We're going to introduce a bill against it.
Do you know that there's something very odd because it's definitely on silent. There you are. I'll try again. But yeah, well, I actually did want mobile phones banned in schools. Maybe they should be banned in meetings too. That it actually, this bill opens up the concept that as an individual, you need to be careful what you say, and careful
Yeah,
what you say, not in terms of hatred speak. I mean, I don't think I could ever be accused of stirring up hatred. My nature is not to be nasty about people, or I try to be balanced. I always try to be fair, but actually we are all now going to be thinking very carefully about everything we say, and it
yeah,
closes down debate,
yeah,
because there are times you need to talk about things, and sometimes you need to say things that are uncomfortable in a debate.
yeah,
And I think that was really highlighted in the amendment stage and again in the debate stage of this bill, when Joanne Lamont, Jenny Mara, Elaine Smith, Joan McAlpine talked about women's rights and the recognition of biological sex. And they were overnight, between the amendments and the morning, hit on social media and accused of hate crime and stirring up hatred. And I mean, it was vicious.
So this
And
was when they were debating the hate crime bill. So they were,
yeah,
because obviously, I mean, one of the notable exceptions in the bill is women are not included, even though women are, statistically subject to, huge amounts of violence and abuse and harassment from men. Much more likely to be victims. They're not included as a protected characteristic in the same
no,
way as goths are. Um,
but a man who dresses as a woman is protected from hate crime, being insulted as a woman.
right.
So
So this,
there's this sex aggravator. So being a woman by sex, if you like, born a woman,
yeah,
that is not protected.
yeah,
And yet, women are probably one of the biggest groups in receipt of hate crime.
yeah,
So it felt like a big open goal. And the solution to that, the government solution to that, is to have a working group looking at, sex as an identifier and how women can be protected.
yeah,
And that feels and felt quite insulting to an awful lot of women. It felt like, the whole push is to say that women as a sex do not exist, because now we're all going to be gender fluid. And that's a really uncomfortable place. And there is a sense that this bill is now saying, actually, we're closing down those kind of debates, and that if you start saying things like that, you're transphobic. And that's really difficult, insulting, dangerous place to be.
Yeah, and I guess the problem, I mean, it's quite an intractable issue because balancing the sort of rights of transgender people, and obviously transgender people have got, they're subject to harassment and assault.
Absolutely.
But there's almost like a sliding scale, like with the amount of effort, like the way the government in the UK, across the Western world, the way the governments are trying to make it is that anybody can just self-identify. So I could say right now, I'm a woman, and that's that's me legally, medically, morally, all the rest of it, a woman. And I gotta be honest, I'm not a woman. Me saying that I'm a woman doesn't, if I put some effort in, at least got a dress and shaved and put some lipstick on, then maybe, maybe I can use the women's toilets. But I don't think I should be allowed to use nicer smelling toilets just by saying I'm a woman. There seems to be, an intractable thing there that we're looking for absolute solutions to something that's a very sort of grey area.
I think this is about. I mean, this is about hate crime, okay? And there is a difference between a hate crime and a live and let attitude that says I'm entitled to be what I am and you're entitled to be what you are, and a bill that then suggests that they've got more entitlement than you've got entitlement. Yeah. If we're going to have equality, if we're going to say, we're all equal, then we all have the right to believe what we believe, to think what we think, to debate it in a respectful and thoughtful manner.
Yeah.
What we don't have the right to do is override somebody else's rights, because once you start overriding somebody else's rights, you're doing the very thing you're saying you're not trying to do.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
It makes no sense.
Absolutely. And this issue with private conversations in people's homes being made illegal. I mean, this brings to mind, under Chairman Mao, children informing on their parents. It's a very sort of 1984, very Orwellian legislation. I mean that.
And very difficult for your children, because I mean, if like me, you've brought your children up to tell the truth, to be honest, and that the truth cannot hurt you, then if your children are taken aside and said, what was discussed, what did your mother or your father say, or your uncle or your aunt or whoever it was, and your child tells the truth, they become the corroborating evidence for you doing what they're accusing you of. And the key thing here is not about whether or not you'd be found guilty, but it's also about the process you'd go through and the fear in which it instills in you as an individual and your family as a whole, that you feel that your home is invaded and that you don't have this safe space to talk freely. Yeah. But also it opens up the possibility of it being weaponized. So it opens up the possibility of your enemies actually creating vexatious complaints, seeking corroborated evidence, and then using it against you. And I think that is a really, really dangerous place to go.
Yeah.
And that's why, part two of this bill, for many of us, certainly those of a more liberal-minded approach, which is rather odd when the Liberals voted for it, but those of us who believe in the rights of individuals, in who have a libertarian view of the world, and think that actually, whilst we absolutely would never ever support or advocate any kind of hate crime, you do have a right to have discussion. You do have a right to explore things, and you certainly have a right to privacy in your own home.
Yeah, and a right to be wrong sometimes. And it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of the anxiety that people will feel when they're trying to tiptoe around and not say something that'll trigger this bill and mean that they're seen as causing a hate crime, because so much of the hate crime legislation is about people's feelings. It's about people's ability, freedom to feel or not feel that they're being harassed or discriminated against or spoken about as if they're a separate group. But there seems to be very little look at the feelings of people, that constant gnawing anxiety that you're going to accidentally commit a hate crime by saying the wrong word. And interestingly, this bill also abolishes the blasphemy laws, but it seems to bring through new blasphemy laws, because hate crime laws basically say that, you know, these words are so powerful, they're so powerful that if you say them, you have to go to prison. I mean, that seems in essence a blasphemy law.
It does, and I think that we have to remember in all of this is that different people take offence at different things. So, you know, as a comedian, you may tell a joke and, you know, lots of us will roll around with laughter at it. And a few people in the room will go, well, that's not funny. I find that quite offensive. You know,
happens a lot.
Offence is what you as an individual feel.
Yeah.
You know, and I know some people who are incredibly sensitive about everything that's said that they consider to be, you know, politically incorrect, or, you know, and then I know others who in the same place with the same skin color or the same background or the same, I suppose, idiosyncrasies, who would laugh about it, who would join in the joke and laugh at themselves. So, you know, I think there is different levels of tolerance, different levels of offence, taking and giving. And part of being a tolerant society is actually being able to understand that and know when it's appropriate to say something and not appropriate to say something.
What surprises me is like the left, the liberal left, throughout the 80s and the 90s, were trying to get seditious and controversial works of art shown in theatres and galleries, and fighting against censorship. And it was the sort of the right, the Mary Whitehouses who were trying to get things shut down and get people like prosecuted for being offensive. And now it's flipped. Now it's the Conservatives. Now it's the right wing who it was the Conservatives who voted against this bill in Holyrood, along with yourself. And you know, they're trying to stop the censorship. And just going back to what you mentioned about families, about this legislation potentially breaking the bond between parents and their children, as the children, you know, are questioned by the authorities about what the parents said around the dinner table. Because this isn't the first time the SNP have tried to bring through legislation that harms families. There's the Named Person Act, which failed to go through. Do you want to give a really quick overview of that?
Yeah, I mean, the named person was part of a bill, and it was challenged in court. And the principle, actually, the idea was okay. And at the time, I was working professionally in children's services. So oddly, I was actually on what they call the GERFEC implementation team of having to try and deliver the named person's concept. So I was deeply involved in it at the time. And the concept was just that if you had a worry about a child, you would know where to go and who to tell, so that all the little worries could be collected and people could realize that maybe there's an issue going on here that we need to look at. So that concept was fine. But what the SNP did and what they're famous for doing is mismanaging ideas. And they try to legislate them. So they have a good idea, and an idea quite often I could agree with, and then they trash it by making it a law. And when you try to legislate on something, it becomes a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Because, and just to be clear, what was this law? What was the named person?
Well, what they did is they took that basic concept and they turned it into what was famously characterized as a state guardian for every child. And it was called the named person, so that every single child would have this individual that everybody could report any concerns to. But of course, it got completely bogged down, and it started to take away and said, in effect, that this named person would be the person who decided the welfare of this child, every child. You know, they'd look to see whether they were being fed right, whether they went to the right clubs, whether they were turning up to school, da 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 da. Jeez. So, in effect, it was going to override parental rights to all intents and purposes. Yeah. And then came an enormous pushback by parents, opposition members, and it ended up in court, and they lost the court case, and the whole thing fell.
Right.
But what's interesting is they did get through the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, and that went through back in 2012. And that again was a stirring up hatred, and it was to do with the sectarian. It was predominantly a sort of Rangers Celtic issue, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
And they brought through this act that was going to prevent the stirring up of hatred. Of course, what happened is your average football fan who went and sang the club song, not with no intention of stirring up hatred, just because it was what they did, found themselves being arrested, found themselves with the police on their door, found themselves being reported.
Right.
And it became absolutely clear that it was really unworkable. And in March 2018, we as a parliament voted to repeal it. So,
fantastic. And that,
in less than 6 years, a Stirring Up Hatred Act failed because it didn't work.
So that bill, the football bill, was repealed. I mean, what are the next steps for this bill, the hate crime bill, now that it's been passed? Do you think it can be repealed? Can it be challenged in a higher court, or what are you going to do? What are you going to do next to try and combat it?
Well, obviously we're about to go to the polls in May, and I think, the argument that was put forward in Parliament is that Part 2 was removed from the bill, and we discussed that in lengthier time in the next Parliament. The government didn't want to do that, and with the support of the Liberals and the majority of Labour and the Greens, it got through. But in the next Parliament, depending on the makeup of Parliament, obviously, I think it should be revisited. I think we should look at what's happening with it, look at how it's being used, look at whether it's necessary, and revisit it. And that will also be in the context of this working group they've set up, looking at the sort of sex aggravator side of things. But yeah, I personally would like this back off the statute books. I think Part 2 is a dangerous law.
Yeah.
And I think even though it might sit dormant, the fact that it's there means that if they wanted to, it could be used.
Yeah.
And I have huge fears, particularly combined with the whole constitutional issue, that it could be used to close down real debate. And it could be used to actually, the enemies of the ruling party, if you like, could use it very effectively. And I know that sounds very conspiracy theorist, and I'm not really that type, but these kind of things shouldn't be there. They pose risk to an open, fair, free, democratic, society that can actually be tolerant. I think it's illiberal, and I really think that it can be used even through whisper.
Yeah.
Even by somebody saying, oh, you need to be careful because you'll be breaking the law if you do that.
Yeah. Well, like all censorship, I mean, the main censorship doesn't get the headlines. It's invisible. It's the self-censorship that comes as a result of the censorship. And
you've seen that during the COVID lockdown. I mean, it's been incredible to me how passive society has been on one level, and yet, when people are talking to me or out and about, they're whispering to me about what they really feel, but then if they're in a public forum, they're saying the opposite.
Yeah. Well, you can see it you can see it in the difference between what people put on Facebook and what they say in WhatsApp groups. You know what I mean? I think we need to bring the balance back. We need to bring, the acceptable conversation back into the public. Michelle, thanks so much for talking to me. It's been really interesting, and also thanks for opposing the hate crime bill in Parliament yesterday. It's great to see politicians standing up for what's right.
I wish more of them did it.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, brilliant. Well, this has been Leo Kearse talking to Michelle Ballantyne for Unlocked. So become a supporter by clicking the blue supporter button on Facebook. Follow us on YouTube and Twitter and all the rest of it. Michelle, thanks very much, and I'll speak to you soon, I hope.